guys, my name is Anna, you're watching SimCue, and without further ado, let's get into this video. So today we have a big project ahead of us, which is also why this is going to be split into two parts, because I feel like it's a little bit much just to have in one video. What you're seeing today is the exterior, the shell, the wallpaper, and this is in total about 8 hours of work, which also means that this was a much bigger project than I set out for it to be. Because today we're building the Casa Madrigal from the Disney movie Encanto. It was released back in 2021, so it's a little bit old by now, but the thing is that when I can't really sleep, and unfortunately I have a lot of nights where I can't really sleep, I tend to just put something on that can kind of run in the background. And I find that Disney movies work quite well for that because it's usually films that I've seen before, so I'm not super invested on like keeping my eyes open. And they're quite nice and slow to just fall asleep to. But what I did not expect to happen after watching Encanto the second time in my life was for me to get the entire soundtrack stuck in my head on repeat. And when I get a song stuck in my head, it is going nowhere. I'm talking literally 2 weeks of me listening to the same songs inside of my head constantly at all times. So after those 2 weeks, I was so fed up that I felt like I just had to get it out of my system, and I thought, what better way to do that than to build it in The Sims. So here we are, and as I've been rambling, you can already see the overall shape of this place. This is actually much bigger than I thought in the beginning. Now what I'm doing right here is playing around with the roof height a little bit, because the Casa Madrigal has roofs at a lot of different heights, and there is a way to work around that. It's just a very tedious long process. So what you can see here is that I kind of have this one tile column to the side, and then I drag the roof across. This is a way to sort of custom place the height of a roof. But what you might have also noticed is that as soon as I did any type of wall or later on fence, the roof just deletes itself. So we will come back to that later. But another thing that I was also working with a lot for this build was platforms. And they can be a lot of fun, but they can surely enough also cause a lot of problems. I think for this build it actually went quite alright, but it also means that we actually have some quite high walls. Now I don't personally mind that. I actually do think it makes sense because this is just such a grand house. But what you'll come to notice later on is that on the inside the walls don't seem quite as tall, and that's because we have a lot of platforms going on. So for the doors and windows, I generally used a lot of Jungle Adventure and For Rent. I actually think those are the only packs that have windows and doors from. So for the front door, the reference photos has this quite big rounded door that has a brick trim around it, and we don't really have that. So the best way to mimic that was to add an extra wall, then do the Jungle Adventure archway, and then just add the door behind that. Now for the wallpaper, I really wanted a very textured wallpaper, more like a stucco or plaster. And so the wallpaper is very much a mix of actually a base game one that I found, and then also Jungle Adventure and a little bit of For Rent. And I think here for Bruno's tower was really the only one where I couldn't really find a properly textured wallpaper, so it more so looks like paint, but it was more important for me there was the right green color. So on the right side of the house, they actually have quite a large terrace. We can see this in a few scenes, and then we get more of a close-up where they're eating, I suppose, lunch or something out on the terrace, talking about how Isabela is going to get married. And what you will see multiple times throughout this video is that I have one thing down and then I sort of go back and I have to change it, like we're doing here with the walls, because right now I'm now looking at a new set of reference photos, realizing that it's not just a straight walls, it actually has bump outs. And so I would also say in general, this shell or this exterior took way longer than I usually spend on this kind of thing, because there were just so many things to go over and so many changes had to be made as I went along. But I also do think that that is part of what made the build actually really fun to do, because I got to play around with walls, platforms, the roof situation, so much more than in a lot of other builds. And I also rarely build such colorful homes, so that was also a lot of fun. So the terrace has this trellis part that is blue, and technically the door and windows is the same blue color, but I couldn't really find anything that matched, and I felt like it was then better to go with something that actually worked for the build, so that it's the same door as the front door, and then we just have it in this green color. And normally I praise the base game for actually having swatches that match, but these are base game columns, but there was not a low-lying fence that actually matched. So for a lot of the clips, you're going to see this very teeny tiny one from Get to Work, but eventually I do get around to change it, though I'm unsure if that is actually in this video or if it's in the next one. So for Bruno's tower, we have some references that are like from inside the courtyard and then like looking up at the tower. But then I also found this one scene where Mirabel is talking to Luisa, and Luisa's like working with some donkeys or something, but they're actually quite far away from the house. But in the background, very vaguely, you can actually see the house. So I could see a bit of the side of Bruno's tower. And I really didn't expect to be staring at a blurry photo so much, but it honestly helped quite a lot to figure out what this tower actually looks like. So Bruno's tower does have some details that are a little bit difficult to pull off in The Sims. Like each corner is actually a very large column, but I found the best way to mimic that was to kind of make a dent in the wall. So it's missing this little one tile piece and then adding some extra columns to also just add some detail in general. And for detail, we're also adding a roof trim. I really wanted to go with a base game one, but I just found that the one from Enchanted by Nature was the exact right green color. Again, a base game column, and then not a single trim that actually matched it. It is the only thing that the build uses from Enchanted by Nature, so it felt a little bit silly, but it also just looked a little bit better than the slightly darker base game ones. So for the top, there's actually this more grayish part that has this nice curve, and I didn't really know what to do with that. I found that these pieces that are actually just from the base game was probably going to be what worked the best. So I played around with the platforms and the sizing of these a little bit, and I would say it's not ideal. I don't absolutely love it, but I do think it is the closest we're going to get. And of course, the tower isn't done. We will be coming back later and do some roofing that's going to add even more detail to this tower. Moving on to the left side of the house, we obviously have a reference for the front where we can see there is this like balcony, and it does wrap around, but it's difficult to tell how long the balcony actually is. So I did decide to go for quite a long balcony because I didn't really know what details to add to the left side. So I found that this was just a way to sort of break up the space and add a little bit so that we have more than just a flat wall going on, and we will also eventually, when we get around to working on the rooms, get back to this area and do even more changes so that it adds a little bit of interest to this left side of the house. Because the parts that we actually can see are super detailed, and there are just so many colors, there's so many things going on, so I really wanted to try my best to ensure that the sides that we cannot see in the film still match the build. But we've right now moved on to the indoor courtyard, where we are also struggling a little bit with finding matching blue colors. I really wanted to use this fence from Jungle Adventure, and I did eventually find that it came in a brighter blue color, where these Get to Work columns is a close enough match. But to be honest, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't just get a wooden column with Jungle Adventure that like perfectly matched this very bright fencing. Now on the ground floor, one part of the balcony is held up by the same blue columns, and the other part of the balcony is held up by these like brick archways. And you can see here that I tried a couple of different things and nothing really worked out. These are specifically from werewolves, but I didn't like the look of those either. And then I tried columns with spandrels, but that didn't really get the right arch, and I was struggling a little bit because technically this is medium wall height, but because we are now like 3 or 4 platforms up, medium archways didn't actually fit. So I just ended up going with some base game ones, and I do think it looks nice even if it's not quite as close to what it looks like in the film. So we've now moved on upstairs, where I am figuring out how all of these rooms are going to be laid out. So while we do have plenty of references for the placement of the doors, there is no reference as to how these magical rooms actually work. And so I think I've probably already mentioned it, but I had to go back and forth between the exterior and the interior and make changes at all times just to get everything to actually add up and match and work, and the window placement, and it was a whole thing. But I was very happy with how it actually turned out in the end, and that every single room became a somewhat proper sized room. So all of the rooms are functional, all of them have beds, all of them are somewhat inspired by the person actually living there. They are very different in sizes, but I think that's okay as well. I'm just very happy that everyone has an actual functional room. So just adding some spandrels, and then we will also be adding in a staircase. Now the staircase in the middle of the courtyard isn't actually a regular part of the casita, but we just see it in so many clips because the film kind of evolves around the whole thing with Antonio getting his gift, and therefore there's a staircase up to his room, so I did decide to leave it in. And then this tile right here is actually from Businesses and Hobbies, but even though it looked kind of similar to the one in the film, I found that it was still just like too busy since there were so many tiles. So I did end up just going for one from For Rent, and I do find that in general just works better for the house since there are so many items from For Rent. Now in a moment we will be moving on to what I like to call the archway hallway, and here I also had to make some changes because as soon as I looked at reference photos from the inside, I noticed that there were windows clearly to the outside. Now this was a pretty quick fix of just moving a wall, and I also found that it did add some interest to the outside. But of course, every time I have to do something like this, it just adds time to the build. So if I haven't already mentioned it, today you're only really seeing the exterior or the shell. I know there's a little bit of the interior going on as well, but the overall building. And this is about 8 hours of footage. And it was really when I'd finished that part that I realized how long this was going to take. But at the same time, I was also already in way too deep for me to just call it quits. I did then naively think that the interior was going to be way quicker, and I was very wrong. So this is just in general a very big, very long build. We've moved on to Isabela's tower, where I also realized looking at some other reference photos where we are again, I think from the courtyard looking up at it, I realized that the top of her tower is actually blue and filled with windows. So I of course went and then added that in. And I think this is probably also the point where I've just realized how many details there are in this house. And with the risk of people clicking away, never ever watching the second part of this video, I can already tell you, like, this was not worth it. I talked about this when building Santa's workplace, where I was like, oh, was it really worth spending so much time on this, like, one build? And in that video, I said that if just one person commented, like, oh, this is a nice build, I would be like, yes, that's worth it. But Santa's workplace was only a total of 9 hours, and I thought that was an extremely long time to spend on one build, even though it was quite big. So just to put things into perspective, I almost spent the same amount of time on just what you're seeing today. And then on top of that, we're going to have the interior and all of the landscaping as well. And so was the build worth it? I asked myself when I was finally done. No, it was not. Because when my brain finally decided to play another tune and I didn't constantly hear, "It was my wedding day," I realized that this is by now quite an old film, so who would ever be interested in this build? It was a lot of fun to build. I do think it is a really cool build, but honestly, I understand if you're like, why? Because I asked myself that as well. But if we for a second don't really think about the fact that it's technically a Disney movie released back in 2021 and it's kind of outdated by now, it's still a pretty good build. And it was definitely also a challenging build, which I honestly do quite like because it just means that I get to really work and sort of cheat the system, push the system to make what I actually want to. And I think the roof, which is also what we're working on here, is a very good example of that. You can see the same thing that I mentioned earlier, where I just have this like one tile column to the side, and then I sort of raise that up or down depending on the height that I want the roof at. And I'm currently working on placing all of these roofs because I thought, well, the walls are kind of, said and done. And then I later started working on the interior, and it turns out when you then work on the interior, you realize new things that need to be tweaked a little bit. So these roofs just kept deleting themselves, and I had to constantly replace them because it was bugging my OCD a little bit if there were clips where the roofs were there and then they were gone and then they were back. And so each time they deleted themselves, I replaced them just so that when you are watching the video, the roofs are either there or they are not there. So that also added a little bit of a time to this project, but right now we're working a little bit more on Isabela's tower. Her tower is filled with flowers and greenery, and looking at some different reference photos, this actually changes throughout the film. I think maybe in the beginning it's more so like green, and then more towards the end it becomes these very pink flowers. Now, unfortunately, this very gorgeous flower set from Jungle Adventure didn't actually come in full-on pink, so I did just go for the red one, and then I think I also later maybe add a little bit of white. But overall, I do think that it turned out really nicely. Now, for the roof, I found these very gorgeous, very pink flowers in the debug catalog, and I was very happy to find debug flowers because, as some of you might know, after Enchanted by Nature, they were supposed to make it easier to place plants on roofs, but they also kind of made it even more difficult. But the debug flowers don't really follow the same rules as the regular flowers, so you can just raise them up, play around with them, and you don't constantly get the little red box that says cannot place flowers close to the roof. So right here at the end, we're just working on the back. I obviously had no reference photos for this, so this is me just freestyling. And it is definitely the more boring part, which really boils down to two things. First, not having reference photos, but secondly also the fact that we're now on the very edge of the lot. I built this in Tomarang because I knew I was going to use a lot of for rent, so I just found that this was where the build was going to work the best. Now, I am aware that technically this film is set in Colombia and for rent is more like Asian, but we kind of have to work with what we have. Now, the game clip is going to end quite abruptly, but I will be coming back already this Saturday, because if you haven't noticed, this is actually posted on a Thursday, and normally I post on Saturdays. And that is because for February, I've kind of wanted to challenge myself to post 2 videos a week. So you don't have to wait long, and hopefully you will be back to watch part 2 where we do the entire interior and where the Casa Madrigal finally comes to life. So with that, I wish you a lovely day. I hope to see you next time, and bye!